Record.
Hello, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about happiness. Welcome to the Specifist. Specify your philosophy and life. In particular, we're going to be talking about unconscious or unaware happiness. Because I think this is something we can fall into, a trap that's really easy to fall into. Because so it's really interesting, right? So on one hand, there is a kind of impermanence of all things, happiness, love, whatever it is, right? But on the other hand, the mind tries to make the impermanent permanent by saying, if X happens, Y will happen. I will be happy, but doesn't think of what happens after that, which kind of creates this illusion of permanence. I mean, if we think about it a little harder than that, we realize that it's not going to be, but the mind doesn't think about it harder than that usually. And so, what I've noticed happens is when this happens, when happiness finally happens, the mind relaxes, the mind loses awareness, falls asleep again, and then kind of like let's say then something else happens that's not happy for the mind. The mind wakes up startled because it has to be a really fast wake up. Like, have you ever been woken up with a really loud sound, or any startled by any loud sound? It's kind of like that. You wake up really quick, like boom, oh shit, what was that? And then you wake up, and then you have to deal with that in some way. And
Speech on left channel on. Recording to Pro. Recording duration Pro.
there kind of like is a trick the mind plays on you. You get happy, you find happiness, and you fall asleep. It's really interesting. I don't know exactly what causes this, but my guess is because we don't think about what happens next. Because we don't think about that, when it happens, it's a big shock. It's like boom, oh shit, where that? I did not expect that to happen. It's almost like taking a big drink of something, not realizing how big it was, and trying to swallow it all. Sometimes it hurts your throat, and then you go, oh man, that was a big swallow, that was too big for my throat, that kind of thing. So that's what I want to talk about. Analyzing this form of happiness, what causes it, why, how do you avoid such a thing, how do you avoid being trapped into this lulled sense of false security, because it really is false, because security doesn't exist. And how or why should you avoid it, if you should at all, which I'm not even sure you can, but it's just something to become aware of. It's not something to judge yourself over, like, oh no, I did this bad thing. It's not even really like a advice episode, like, oh, you should do this. It's more like a become aware of this. You should become aware of this before it happens to you again, and before you fall asleep. It's probably going to happen to you again anyways, but maybe I can warn you before that happens. And maybe you'll take that warning to heart, and then when it happens, you're aware, and then you go, oh, that's what he was talking about. So, what causes this? It's precisely the non-thinking that causes it, the non-awareness. Because it's not just happiness that just happens with it, also happens with peace. And I'm sure it can happen with love as well, because you fall in love with somebody, but you don't think about the what next, what happens next, what happens, you don't think about the possibility that this love will end in a bad way or just end in any kind of way. It's so funny to me how, like, I've listened to some of these songs. I'm not a big lyric person, but sometimes I listen to some of these songs because people listen to the radio. I don't really like radio, but some people do, and some people listen to the radio. And you hear all these love songs where it's so blatantly foolish, in my opinion, because a lot of times love songs are like, oh, you're gonna be mine forever, or like, you're my true love, or whatever. It's all this kind of like this idea that love will last forever enters into it and things like this. And my first thought is, maybe that's true. Hey, maybe that happens. But the chances of that happening are not necessarily the best. You probably have better odds of, I don't know. But, the point isn't to get you negative over that. It's to make you realize, oh, wait a minute, I have these false illusions about, happiness and peace. Like, oh, if this happens, I'll be happy. But then what? It's not about being negative. It's not about like going, oh no, then I'll be sad again. It's more like, well, what'll happen after I get happy? I might get happy for a little bit. But then what happens? Maybe something happens, like a horn beeps or somewhere, or somebody calls me and says that you need to do this and do that, or do whatever it is for whatever reason. And you go, oh man, that's a lot of things I have to do, so many things today. And then you go, and then your happiness fades, maybe replaced by frustration and annoyance and things like this, right? And I don't really think it's about like stopping happiness. There was a time where I was like, no, we shouldn't be happy. Well, not really shouldn't be happy, but like, what good is happiness if it's not going to really do anything for you? On the long run, it's kind of like a distraction, really. And it is, in a lot of cases, it is. But on the other hand, I understand the point of happiness, living life and going, oh, yay, that was fun, or whatever, right? But happiness, or the problem isn't really even happiness. The problem is unaware happiness and unaware peace. Because what I've noticed happens is that the mind has this idea. Not everybody. Maybe this isn't true for everybody. Maybe it's just true for some people. And if so, maybe it'll help you see this more and whatnot. But if not, please disregard this episode and move on to another one. I'm not going to be offended at all. And, I might talk more about this on another episode, but I'm really starting to make the distinction between practical topics and topics that don't really matter to me. If something doesn't really affect me personally, I'm not going to really be interested in it. And I think that's true. I think that should be true for most people. Because, most people have busy lives, and you only have so many hours in the day and whatnot. So if you don't find this to be true, by all means, leave and find another episode, or listen to another podcast or whatever. It's fine. Or you can pause this recording and come back to it later. But anyways, the happiness happens, the peace happens, but there is no what next in the mind. The mind kind of like, it almost kind of falls asleep. There's like this weird thing that it does where it kind of gets lulled into, it's almost like making a baby fall asleep. You know, you rock the baby and you make the baby feel home and safe and whatnot. I like the inner child kind of stuff. I guess it's kind of similar. And so when happiness happens, when peace happens, or any kind of security or safety or whatever, the mind might go, ah. But then it stops all the practices, the spiritual practices, the mental practices, the meditation practices, whatever it is, awareness practices. And it falls asleep. And it goes, and then something happens, boom, and it wakes up. The mind wakes up really, really mad because it was sleeping, and it wakes up, and because it was woken up in such a startling way, it makes the suffering worse than it would have normally been. If that makes any sense. And so the mind is clearing, or the mind is getting happiness or peace, falling asleep, waking up in a jolt, bam, and that adrenaline comes, suffering comes, struggle comes. And so I think the point of this episode is to hopefully get you to see that your mind does this as well. If not now, maybe you'll see it in a couple of months or years or whatever when you observe more. And then you go, oh, this is what he was talking about. I've seen this myself, And it's not really about like a contemplating what happens next. Because I think we all know what's going to happen next. Happiness is going to end. Suffering might begin, or something else will begin. Or happiness will lessen or whatever. And then your mind goes, no, or whatever. It's more about becoming aware while you are being happy. Whether that be a light focus or a heavy focus, it doesn't really matter. Light focus meaning like you're not like extremely focused. Like, there are different like levels of focus and awareness. There's one kind of level where you're like watching. There's an episode by Life is Art, going over like the differences between watching and observing. I don't know if I'd use the say that they are different necessarily, but what I would say is that what she's talking about has more to do with awareness versus non-awareness, in a sense, because when you're learning versus non-learning, because when you're aware of something, so there's two levels, there's two ways of becoming aware of something, right? And one way is kind of useful in some ways because it can kind of get you away from your mind if you do it right, especially if you do this while with your mind. And that is just to become aware without learning anything about what you're becoming aware of, without analyzing it, just becoming aware of it. The other way is to become aware of it, to learn about it, to observe it. And so the differences are mainly that one is kind of more of a directed flow of awareness, and one is less directed. It's a little more diffuse. Like non-learning awareness is kind of like, let's say you're watching television or something, Are you extremely focused on the television or what the television is saying? Probably not, unless it's educational or whatever that you're watching. Or you're at least listening to or reading a book that you've read before. You're not going to be super focused on what the book is saying because you've read it before. Unless you're like really trying to get more information from it as possible, And so, in the same way, awareness, learning versus non-learning awareness is like this. It's exactly the same thing. There's awareness where you're becoming aware of watching something. Like you're observing something to learn from it. Like you're reading a book. Oh, this is interesting. I didn't know this, or this is interesting. Or you're reading a book just because it's an enjoyable practice or whatever. But you're not trying to gain knowledge from it or whatever. And there's also like basic differences between learning within learning awarenesses as well. There's system based learning awareness versus non-system based learning awareness. Non-system based learning awareness is kind of like where you're learning the content, like you're reading the book, you're memorizing what the book is saying. You might be looking at what certain chapters are saying. But with system based learning, you're looking for underlying principles of what the book is saying, mechanics of these principles and life, if it's a life book. Or, like, there's different ways of reading any kind of book. Like, it doesn't really matter what it is. It could be like a fantasy book, like about power, like magical power, right? You can literally make systems out of this. And you can explain how the power works if you understand it deep enough in this kind of way with the system-based learning practice. It's a lot more focused to do this, and it's a lot less surface level and a lot more structure to do it this way. But you can get more information because as you do this. Anyways, going back to what we were talking about. So with happiness, what you normally have is either non-learning awareness or non-awareness, period. Awareness lessens, you stop the practices. And the reason is kind of obvious, right? Because, like, say, for instance, you do something to win something, whatever it is. Like, let's say you're playing a game, right? And you want to win. You want to get to level 40 or whatever. So you play and play and play until you get to level 40. But once you get to level 40, you stop because you're like, oh, I'm already here. There's nowhere else to go. What can I do now that I haven't already done? And so you stop playing. You become less aware of the game, and eventually you forget about the game. And the same is true for happiness, security, peace. You try and do whatever it takes to get to happiness. Well, not necessarily whatever it takes, but you know what I mean. Like, you meditate, you do whatever it is. You get to happiness for a time, and then you stop chasing. You stop doing things to get happiness, to get peace, and you sit within the peace, and you become less aware. So it makes sense why this happens, systematically speaking. And so I'm not judging anybody at all for this. This is basically based mostly on observational awareness. and whatnot. So, how would you overcome this? How would you deal with this properly? I think there's multiple ways, and I'm not saying that I have ultimate solutions or anything, because I don't think you can 100% go beyond this and deal with this completely. I think it's about perhaps slowly over time, dealing with this. Perhaps. And that's, a big maybe, because it's possible that it may not even work. But there are some suggestions. One of them is to, if your mind says, if I get this, I'm going to be happy. If I get that, I'm going to be happy. If I get this, I'm going to be peaceful, whatever it is. Let's say your mind says that. You go, okay, so then what? And you think about it. You go, oh, that happiness is going to go, or my mind's going to get annoyed again. Doesn't mean you stop looking for the happiness, so you stop doing the things that you do to get happiness. It just means that once you get it, you realize that happiness isn't going to leave, or is going to leave eventually, or something is going to change, and you become aware with a light focus. And there's like two basic levels of either learning or non-learning awareness, besides systematic or content-based learning awareness, which is light focused awareness or heavy focused. Usually with heavy focus, it's the flows of awareness, if you can call them such things, are more directed towards certain things. Like if you're trying to learn let's say you're trying to learn how to do something, and you have a user guide, you would be looking at specific sections of the user guide to figure out how to do whatever it is that you're trying to do. That's more heavy focus. That's more like directed focus. Light focus is where you're paying attention to surroundings, but you're not necessarily trying to get details or anything. You're just lightly focused on what it is. What is happening right now? Or what is happening in your mind or your body. And you can go heavy focus with that if you want, but it's these are basic differences. So those are the basic ways, I think, to deal with this. And the overall goal, I think, is overall, by becoming more aware while you are happy, you can kind of overcome some of this a little bit. It's not going to be perfect. And eventually I will be talking more about letting go of the need to control and to be happy based on my own experience of learning certain things and whatnot. So anyways, this is The Specifist, and I will talk to you on the next episode.